الله يلطف يا رب. الله يتستر يا رب.
After devastating Iranian missile attacks on Israel, a full combat alert was triggered across every branch of the United States military. Air Force wings, Marine Corps units, and fighter squadrons all received the signal to move into immediate combat readiness. The directive was issued without delay. Everything began moving at once. Marines were quickly transported from their barracks to the nearby airfield using military buses. When they arrived, they started boarding a massive C-17 Globemaster III that was waiting on the tarmac with its rear ramp already lowered. At the same moment, cargo crews were bringing additional equipment toward the aircraft using forklifts and flatbed carts. Portable generators, crates of ammunition, communications systems, medical equipment, and other supplies were moved toward the plane. Inside the cargo bay, everything was secured and strapped down next to the Marines preparing for transport. This aircraft was scheduled to stop at another military installation first, where more personnel and additional equipment would be loaded before continuing toward the Middle East fully packed. At another nearby base, several more C-17 aircraft were already in the process of being loaded. Cargo handlers drove armored vehicles directly up the ramps into the aircraft. Tactical buggies, armored transport trucks, MRAPs, and other combat vehicles were carefully positioned and secured inside the cargo holds. At a separate airfield, maintenance crews were busy preparing fighter jets that would soon be used for sustained combat strikes against enemy military positions. Every aircraft underwent a complete inspection. Avionics systems were checked, radar equipment tested, and wiring and electronics examined panel by panel. Technicians carefully reviewed every detail. Missiles and guided bombs were mounted onto the weapon pylons beneath the wings. Engine covers were removed, air intakes inspected, and fuel systems carefully checked. These fighter jets needed to be in perfect working condition because they would soon be flying continuous combat sorties for several days without interruption. Meanwhile, in another part of the base, soldiers gathered inside a large hangar and began organizing their personal equipment. They packed duffel bags and rucksacks with everything required for a long deployment. Uniforms, extra boots, hygiene kits, and personal belongings were packed carefully. These troops were not preparing for a short assignment. They were being deployed to a military base somewhere in the Middle East for an unknown duration. No one had been given a return date. I think usually we got it. As dusk approached, the order finally came to prepare for boarding. The soldiers formed organized columns outside the hangar and began marching toward their assigned aircraft on the runway. They climbed up the rear ramps and took their seats inside the waiting C-17 transport planes. Loadmasters moved through the cargo bay, conducting final checks on equipment and personnel head counts. The ramps were slowly raised and sealed shut. One by one, the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. Moments later, they lifted off into the sky, disappearing into the darkness. Upon arrival in the Middle East, the C-17 aircraft touched down, and the unloading process began immediately. The rear ramps dropped open. Soldiers quickly stepped out onto the tarmac. Vehicles were unchained and driven down the ramps. Cargo pallets were pulled out using forklifts waiting nearby. Everything moved quickly and efficiently. These same aircraft would soon turn around and begin flying back again. Their mission was to make multiple trips, collecting more soldiers from different bases across the United States and delivering them to this same location. For the soldiers stepping down onto the runway, this base in the Middle East would now be their temporary home. They had no clear timeline and no confirmed return date. They picked up their bags, followed directions from base personnel, and began moving toward their assigned living quarters. The military buildup had begun, and more flights were already on the way. Across the airfield, maintenance crews worked continuously preparing fighter jets for upcoming combat missions. Aircraft were parked in long rows across the apron. Some were positioned under the open sky, while others were pulled into reinforced hardened shelters. Fuel trucks moved from jet to jet. A mechanic connected the single-point refueling nozzle to the aircraft's fueling port located on the fuselage. JP-8 aviation fuel began flowing into the tanks. The fuel level was monitored carefully using the gauge panel on the truck. Once the tanks were completely full, the hose was disconnected and the fueling cap sealed tightly. Then the truck moved on to the next aircraft. Weapons crews arrived pushing loading carts carrying ordnance. Air-to-air missiles were lifted carefully onto the wingtip rails and locked securely into place. Guided bombs were mounted beneath the wings using mechanical hoists. Each weapon was then connected to the aircraft's onboard electronic systems. The wiring harnesses were plugged in and the data link confirmed. Arming pins with bright red safety flags were inserted into every weapon. Those pins would remain in place until the aircraft was ready to taxi for takeoff. After installation, each weapon went through a final visual inspection. Technicians checked the mounting lugs, the release mechanisms, and the alignment with the pylons. The entire process was repeated again and again for every fighter jet positioned on the flight line. One aircraft after another moved through the same preparation sequence: fuel, weapons, airframe, avionics, flight controls, engines. By the time the pilots arrived for their mission briefing, every fighter jet on that ramp was fueled, armed, inspected, and fully ready to fly.